In a typical interest rate swap, you've got two parties who agree to exchange cash flows at some point in the future, with one party making payments based on a fixed rate of interest and the other party agreeing to make payments based on a floating rate of interest. So you've got a fixed for floating swap. A basis swap is the same setup, except it's floating for floating instead of fixed for floating. Each party is making payments based on a floating rate of interest. So you might be wondering, why would you want to exchange floating rate payments? And the reason is you would want to reduce basis risk. Okay, so basis risk is what happens when you have cash flows that are affected by factors that aren't perfectly correlated. And a great example is if you had a bank and they had floating rate assets and floating rate liabilities, and you think, oh, so if interest rates go up, both the assets and liabilities are tied to a floating rate, so there's not going to be any effect on the bank's net interest income, for example. But if the floating rate assets are pegged to one index and the floating rate liabilities are pegged to a different index, then there could be issues if the indexes don't move at the exact same amount. Okay, so let's do an example here. Let's say we've got a bank, they've got a floating rate asset that is indexed to the 6-month LIBOR. Okay, so here's the asset, 6-month LIBOR, which happens to be, let's say, 0.16%. Okay, that happens to be the 6-month LIBOR. And then they've got a floating rate liability, and that's indexed to the 1-month LIBOR. So here's the liability. 1-month LIBOR happens to be 0.10%. Okay, so that's the basic setup. And you see there's a difference between the two indexes of initially 0.06 percentage points. Okay, so that's the difference between here. That's the spread. Now, let's say that interest rates change. Okay, let's say interest rates change and interest rates go up. And so now the 6-month LIBOR is 0.17%. Okay, so it's increased. It went from 0.16% to 0.17%. Okay, so that's here. Now the floating rate liability tied to the 1-month LIBOR, that goes up, but it goes up from 0.1 to 0.13%. Okay. So now if we look at the difference between the two indexes, we went from, so the difference here was 0.06%. Okay, so now let's look at the difference between these two. Okay, 0.04. Okay, now we see that there has, and what has happened, basically the liability, okay, the interest on the liability, that floating rate on the liability is going to go up more than the floating rate on the asset. So even though the asset and the liability both pegged to a floating rate, they're tied to different indexes. Okay, one's in the 1-month LIBOR, the other one the 6-month. And so if they don't change by the same amount, then the floating rate on the asset and the liability, in this case, the floating rate on the liability is going to go up higher than the floating rate on the asset. So even though interest rates went up and they're both rates go up, they don't go up by the same amount. So that's basis risk. Okay, so what the bank could do, enter into a basis swap where they agree to pay cash flows based on the 1-month LIBOR, and then they'd have to throw in a premium because it's lower typically. And so they're making cash flow payments based on the 1-month LIBOR, and then they're going to receive cash flows based on the 6-month LIBOR from a counterparty. So they set up a basis swap to address this basis risk here.